1 Samuel chapter 17. I want to read all 50 verses. I debated all week about this and finally convinced myself that you wouldn't walk out on me, so here we go. Now the Philistines gathered their forces of war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim and between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, and the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a picture, and I decided not to go into all the literal of how much stuff weighed. It was just a lot, and this dude was a big guy. But what we see in the last part of what I've read already is there was actually 2 people that came out. There was Goliath and then his shield bearer, and he carried a shield that was to protect Goliath from arrows. So it was a very tall shield. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me if he is able to fight and kill me, and we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, and this last part of verse 11 is a very sad rendering, or reflection would be a better word, of the mindset that is taking place among the leader of the children of Israel and the Israelites themselves. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, we tend to look at this story and think Goliath was the problem, but that's not true. As we know by the end of the story, Goliath was taken care of quite easily, as a matter of fact. The problem is in verse 11. Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. That's the problem in the story. Verse 12. Now David and the son of Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They're with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines." So let me stop at verse 20 and kind of get this picture. When David goes there, he has no intention of fighting. In other words, we could sort of consider that Goliath just sort of all of a sudden rose up in David's path. It wasn't a problem he was expecting to deal with. He was just there to deliver some snacks to his brothers and their commander, and then come on back and do his duty of dealing with the sheep. So I'm saying that because I want you to sort of, as you begin to own the story and what it says to you, realize that this giant, this problem that we've always attributed to this Goliath, all of a sudden became a part of David's life. It wasn't something he was anticipating dealing with, much like many problems in our own lives that just all of a sudden visit us. So we're at verse 20. Early in the morning, David left the flock with the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath the Philistine, champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual 40-day defiance. And David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel." Now I want to stop there for a moment. When we read he comes out to defy Israel, we can read in our minds he comes out to defy God. Because Israel was God's chosen people. So when Goliath was coming out with his defiant words, he was defying God, which is why David says to him what he does a little bit later. Let me pick it up. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel. Sorry, but I got to say this part too. The end of verse 25 is directly connected to the end of verse 11. Saul is terrified and dismayed, and so what does he do? Instead of dealing with it like he should have as a leader, he tries to bribe somebody into taking care of that which he should have taken care of. Says a lot about the man. Verse 26. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, or who is this ungodly man that he should defy the armies of the living God? They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Words of a man filled with guilt. Because he's a part of verse 11, the terrified and dismayed. Now what have I done, asked David. Sounds like a little brother had been picked on quite a bit, doesn't it? Now what have I done? Can't I even speak? In other words, do my thoughts and opinions not even matter? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. When David said what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Now, I'm reading between the lines of verse 31 and 32, but my reading between the lines here is Saul thinking to himself, Finally, I got somebody to take care of this. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight for him. And Saul replied with a disappointed voice, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy, and he's been a fighting man from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. Now let me go back to verse 34. What happens in verse 34 is what we used to do a lot of times on Sunday nights and occasionally on Sunday mornings, testimony time. David stands and gives his testimony. He's talking about what God is doing in his life. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised or this ungodly Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. It's not nice, but when I hear Saul say that, I think, you big chicken. Verse 38, then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put on a coat of armor on him, a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. He couldn't even walk in them. I can't go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. I love this next part. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer, 2 against 1, in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy, or in other words, he had red hair and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. Verse 47 is directly tied to verse 11 and to that other verse 20, whatever. If Saul would have understood this, he wouldn't have been terrified and dismayed. If Saul would have been the man of God he should have been, and we're going to see how, we're going to look back how we know he wasn't, but if he had been the man of God that he should have been, he would have understood. It wasn't his battle. Goliath wasn't the problem, Saul was. The Lord was going to take care of this. That's exactly what David says. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him, and reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. I learned today, or this week, I've studied this passage a lot of times. For the first time, I learned that sling and how it was fashioned was able to deliver a stone with the same velocity as a .45 pistol. Now, I can't prove it, but that's what I read. Because of the way that it was fashioned, the length of it, and the speed that it could be delivered, that's what I read. Interesting enough. So in other words, the Philistine got shot in the head with a .45 pistol. That'd bring anybody down, even a giant. The stone sank in his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Father, thanks. I need your help today. The notes are in front of me, but I've got to have your Holy Spirit working. I just do. We need to learn. We need to be reminded, encouraged. We need to be sent out of here understanding that whatever giants are in our lives, they can be defeated not by us, not by positive thinking or reading the next book or even someone patting us on the back, but by you. The battle is the Lord's. And I pray that as we leave here, we wouldn't just be encouraged and blessed. We would be equipped. Because there's a world out there and there's stuff out there. And we're going to meet it head on. And some of it's going to surprise us, much like Goliath jumped in David's path. And as those that can be more than conquerors, we need to not be Sauls, but we need to be Davids in the world we're a part of. So I pray you'd speak to us today in your name. Amen. I love movies about underdogs who persevere. My favorite kind of movies are those that not very long into the movie, you figure out who this guy is. He's the underdog. All the odds are against him. And he perseveres and he overcomes. And by sheer guts and determination, he achieves a goal that by all expectations should not have been achieved. Even if in the beginning you figure, okay, I see where this is going, and he's going to face a lot of stuff, but in the end he'll win. I still like him. I like him. That's why the movie Hoosiers is one of my all-time favorite movies. How many of you know the movie Hoosiers? Come on. Oh, you need to watch it. Hoosiers tells the story of a small-town Indiana high school basketball team that wins the state championship. It's loosely based on the Milan, Indiana high school team that won the 1954 state championship. One of my favorite scenes is when Coach Norman Dale, played by Gene Hackman, escorts his team onto the gym where the championship is going to be played. Now, these are just country kids out of a small country town, and I'd really kind of thought about showing the movie, but I got more notes than I'm going to be able to preach quickly, so I decided to show that scene. But these kids walk in. You know, these are from a country town in Indiana, and they're looking around at this gymnasium that's bigger than anything they've ever seen, and you can just see the wonder on their face and the dismay and terror. And so they walk in to this high school gym. And as he escorts them in, it's huge compared to the gyms they've played in. It feels intimidating, and they're looking around in wonder and amazement. And the coach pulls out a measuring tape, and with help from one of the players, measures from the free throw line to the basket. And as they do, he says, I believe you'll find it to be 15 feet, just like back home. Then he asks one of the players to get on another player's shoulders, and they measure from the rim to the floor. And he says, I believe you'll find it to be 10 feet, just like back home. And he says, I think you'll find its exact same measurements as our gym back at Hickory. And his point was, as I understood it, intimidation will keep you from accomplishing your goal. That one thing is what kept Saul from accomplishing what from a teenage boy accomplished. He was intimidated. He was overcome. He did not recognize that God would use him and be at work in his life. He was just completely intimidated. Interestingly enough, in the locker room, just before the team took the court, the preacher says, it's a small Indiana town. They were allowed to have a preacher pray for him. The preacher says this, and David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it, and it struck the Philistine on the head, and he fell to the ground. Amen. I love that scene. I love it. I love that movie. The story of David and Goliath is, of course, one of my favorite Bible stories because it's like movies. This kid who isn't supposed to win conquers in the end. It's great. Maybe it's yours too. It's popular, it's well known, but it really isn't so much a story about an underdog defeating a giant. Because the fact is, the giant was the underdog. He didn't stand a chance simply because of the truth of 1 Samuel 17:46. David makes it clear. He was in partnership with God. This day, the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down. You see, we tend to view that story as a fight between David and Goliath. It wasn't a fight between David and Goliath at all. It was a fight between Goliath and God. And if Saul would have understood that, all of Israel wouldn't have had to be terrified. David was the only one who understood. He makes it very clear, I'm not going to fight him. I'm just going to go out there and throw a stone in the air. God's the one that's going to deliver it. That's what he says. He has a complete understanding. The fact is, the giant was the underdog. While we read the story in 1 Samuel 17 and think of it as an epic battle between a teenage kid and a 9-foot giant, that's really only an illustration of the greater and I think more important message for us today. And there is a message. The reason that story is so popular is because tucked in there is a message for us today. It isn't just about then, it's about us now. And the story I'd like for us to consider is how the giant was dealt with. How he was viewed, how he was dealt with first by Saul and then by David. The coach was right. The basket in the gym was 10 foot off the ground, both in small town Hickory and at the state championship. It didn't matter how big the gym was or even the size of the crowd or the event itself. What mattered was preparation, attitude, teamwork, and determination. What mattered was preparation, attitude, teamwork, and determination. Those factors also played in how both David and Saul saw and responded to Goliath. Those 4 words, those 4 facts, those 4 things determined how first Saul saw Goliath and responded, and how David saw Goliath and responded. It's interesting. It was the same Goliath, with all his size, armor, and words of challenge, that terrified and dismayed Saul, as it was that caused David to say to a terrified Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Now, I've said a lot, and I'm waving around a lot, and I don't want you to get lost in my waving or my saying. Here's what I want you to hear with me. Same giant, just 2 different points of view. Same problem, same struggle, same issue. It wasn't that David could say, well, I'll go fight him, but why don't you have him send out somebody half his size to make it fair? It was the very same giant. It was just a different point of view. It was just a different way of looking at it. You have to wonder how in the moment that he heard those words from David, the teenage shepherd boy, Saul, the king of Israel, must have felt. It doesn't say, but I'd have been ashamed if I'd have been Saul. What he said reveals much about how Saul had come to view the giants in his life. Without faith in God or without a godly vision. We read his words in verse 33. You can't fight this Philistine. You're just a kid. And he's an experienced warrior. Notice the difference in young David's reply. I've got experience too. When my father's sheep were attacked by a lion or a bear, I fought and killed them. And you know what? It was God who helped me kill them. And that's exactly what he'll do with this 9-foot problem. Now let's stop there and think about this. Had Saul never seen God do anything? He had. God had done a lot for Saul. Saul could have easily gone back and referenced some of his experiences, but his mindset wasn't able to go back and relate to all that God had done. On the other hand, David said, well, I've got experience. I know he's big and I know he's got experience, but I've got experience too. I've seen what God can do. I know what God can do. I've been there when God did it. I've got experience, and God, the same God that helped me then, is going to help me take care of this 9-foot problem now. What did Saul see? A giant problem in a kid. What did David see? A giant God and a problem that God could solve. The conversation between Saul and David in verses 32 through 37 sums up all of 1 Samuel 17. Saul thought Goliath was the problem, when in reality it was his preparation, attitude, teamwork, and determination that was at fault. And it was David's preparation, attitude, and teamwork and determination that allowed God to guide the stone that defeated the giant and brought the victory to God's people. Now, I can't prove it. You might disagree. You might be right. But I like how I think about this, and that is, I think it wouldn't have mattered where David slung that rock. It was going to hit Goliath right in the head. I do. Now, I think David had prepared and he'd used that sling, and he had skill and ability that he dedicated to the Lord, so he probably deserves the credit for a good shot. And I can't just help but wonder if all of Israel didn't go, whoa, good shot. But I believe God was so involved, it wouldn't have mattered. In fact, it would have been kind of fun if David would just have thrown it the other way and watched it go turn around and come back and nail Goliath in the head. If I'm making the movie, they're going to do that. But you see, David fully comprehended what was at stake, and he fully understood who was going to help him. He saw a giant, he had a giant God and a problem that God could solve. And that conversation reveals to us that David was prepared when Saul wasn't. For Saul, the giant was a problem that stood between him and God, and for David, the giant was an opportunity for him and God to stand in partnership and enjoy a victory. So today, I want to look at those 4 words and how they played out in Saul's defeat and David's victory. The first word is preparation. Preparation. Saul's preparation was to get someone else to take care of the problem. Verse 11 makes it clear that he wasn't a prepared leader when it says, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. You see, we can tell that Saul wasn't prepared because he had a hearing problem. It says he had a hearing problem. He was listening to Goliath's voice instead of God's voice. This is what's interesting about this story. For 40 days, they were simply terrified by Goliath's voice. Goliath would yell and shout and holler and get out there and make fun of them, and they'd be afraid. Nothing happened other than Goliath just got out there and shouted and hollered. They were afraid of Goliath's voice. Saul was listening to Goliath's voice instead of God's voice. In verse 16, we read that this had gone on for 40 days, and for 40 days, Saul heard Goliath convince him of something when he should have been listening to God and asking God what to do. How do we know Saul wasn't listening to God? Because in chapter 15, verse 10, we read, the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I am grieved that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. So Saul had already laid the groundwork of not listening to what God was telling him. And in chapter 16, verse 14, it says, the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. So Saul, because he wasn't walking with the Lord, wasn't prepared to see God work, so he tried to bribe someone else to do it with money, with his daughter, and future tax exemptions. David's preparation can be summed up in chapter 17, verse 37. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. In other words, David had been prepared for this. All he did was he was going to deliver snacks to his brothers. That's all he was about. That's all he was going to do that day. When he left his father's sheep with someone else to watch over them, in his mind was, I'll go give the snacks to my brothers and I'll head back and take care of my sheep. But somewhere along the way, a giant problem rose up. Well, David was already prepared. He'd seen what God could do. He was very experienced by what God had done in the past. So the giant rises up and he says, well, this giant is no tougher than the lion or the bear for God. I'm just going to trust God to take care of it, and I'm going to go deal with it. Now, here's something I think that we don't really maybe notice in this passage, and that is David was perplexed by how everybody else was acting. He didn't understand. Why doesn't somebody deal with this? Because in his mind, it was just a part of his natural thinking because of his relationship with God. In his mind, he just immediately thought, God can take care of this. Why didn't somebody go deal with it? He's defying our God. Why doesn't somebody take care of it? And we see that his preparation summed up again. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. We see David's heart for God early in verse 26. Who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? In other words, why are we allowing this guy to insult our God? Do we not love God? Has he not been good to us? Why are we letting somebody talk about him this way? And in verse 45, as he faces Goliath, I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. My interpretation, I'm about to take you out, and I don't deserve the credit. God's going to do it through me. That's what he was about. David hadn't planned on fighting Goliath. He was just there to bring food to his brothers. But even though he hadn't planned on a giant, when a giant crossed his path, he was already prepared because he'd been with God. That's good for us today, folks. It's practical for us today. Number 2 is the word attitude. Saul's attitude can be summed up in one word: defeated. When a Goliath talking can defeat you, you're in trouble. When it's just words, you're in trouble. When nothing has happened yet, you're in trouble. I know people that just a few things are delivered to them, and they begin a whole story of how, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. Oh, what are we going to do? When the fact of the matter is, a lot of that stuff is just imagined. I wish I'd thought about this when I was writing my sermon. I've got tucked in my files a thing that says, I don't remember the breakdown, but it's like about 90% of the things that we worry about never happen. And I don't know, 7% of them might, but probably won't. And only 2 or 3%. I don't remember how it all breaks down. But that's the truth. And so the children of Israel, along with their leader Saul, were standing there building a scenario based on words alone. And their attitude and Saul's attitude can be summed up in the word defeated. He heard Goliath's voice and he was immediately defeated. He was listening to the wrong voice. He had a giant problem. David's attitude, on the other hand, was defiant. He had a problem with the giant. The giant wasn't a problem. He had a problem with him. He got a look on his face. He was defiant. He was dismayed that somebody didn't shut that Philistine up. And when no one else would do it, his attitude caused him to say, I'll do it. I'm sick of hearing him talk like that. That's ridiculous. I hadn't thought about this before, so you might prove me wrong, but I don't think so. 40 days, they'd been listening to that garbage. He only had to hear it once, and once was enough. Said, I'm not going to put up with this. If you're not going to take care of it, your servant will do it. I'll go do it. His attitude was defiant. The third is teamwork. Saul wasn't on the team. The Spirit of God had left him due to his disobedience. He couldn't partner with God because he wouldn't obey God. He's lost his privilege of being on God's team. God cannot bless or partner with disobedience. Listen to me, folks. God cannot partner with disobedience. God cannot partner with disobedience. The disobedience has to be dealt with before the partnership can be restored. That's just a fact. And so Saul was in a place of disobedience, and God couldn't partner with him. God couldn't work with him. David, on the other hand, understood teamwork and partnership with God. That's what verse 46 is all about. Look at it with me. It's a powerful verse. This day, the Lord will hand you over to me. That's partnership. The Lord is going to give you to me. David didn't say, well, guys, let's stop and pray about it and have God strike him dead. This is a principle that's throughout all of God's word. God partners with us. He works with us. There's a lot that God won't do alone. He says to us, you and I are going to do it together. And we see that very clearly in that passage of Scripture, in David's attitude and the fact that David was on the team. The Lord is going to deliver you to me. He'll hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down. The Lord is going to empower me. We're going to work in partnership together, and I'm going to see to it that you shut up. It wasn't just God. It wasn't just David. It was God and David. They were a team. And I just realized that I said shut up in a sermon, and my mother is not happy with me. Actually, that's nicer than saying, I'm going to kill you, though, which is what he did. It's a simple principle, but I want to just stand on it for just a moment before we move to the fourth word. It's teamwork. It's working with God. It's always about that. It's always about saying, God, what do you want to do through me? It is often about us saying, God, you have given me particular gifts and abilities. How do you want to use them for your glory? And there's a balance. There's preparation, there's an attitude, and there's teamwork. And the fourth word is determination. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, we're introduced to a young man by the name of Saul. In verse 2, we read these words. This is a description of Saul. Saul was as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. That's the guy that would soon be king of Israel. Now, when you think about Saul, tall and good looking, and then you look at me, I am an example of determination. I got the girl without any of the abilities that Saul had. I wasn't tall. I wasn't good looking, so I decided to be charming, and I promised her things I haven't given her yet after 37 years of marriage. It'll be fun, I said. No, Saul was the guy who, in some ways, you could argue, was chosen because of his outward appearance. David, on the other hand, what does the Bible say? God told Samuel when he said, David's the guy, don't judge him by his outward appearance. But there's another little point here that I want to make, and that is, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, a giant was not only challenging Israel, he was challenging the God of Israel. And Saul, the leader and the largest man among men, should have been the one to step forward and say, I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Saul was taller than any of his men. He was the guy that should have faced the giant. Instead, Saul tried to bribe one of those under him to do his job. He was dismayed and terrified. In 1 Corinthians 15:58, it says, brothers and sisters, be strong and immovable. Always work enthusiastically. Another version says, always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, for you know that nothing you do for the Lord is ever useless, and that describes determination. Saul should have been determined. I will not let you insult my God. For David, we see the truth of 1 Corinthians 15:58. The same God who helped me do the work of my earthly father in tending the sheep will help me do his work, my heavenly Father, in defeating a big, loud, armored up, intimidating, insulting giant. Make no mistake, it was God working through a prepared teammate, a partner named David, who had an attitude that God could and would do it again. God would give him the victory, and he was determined to make sure that it happened. Giants have many looks. They come in all sizes, they wear all kinds of armor, and we all deal with them. All of us. They're the things that seek to defeat and discourage us. They come when we're least prepared. They're bigger than us, and they are loud, and they try to convince us that we should give up and surrender and quit. They might be health problems. They might be marriage issues. They might be a job situation, a family situation, a financial situation, the death of a loved one, or something as simple as a dead battery, a flat tire, or a refrigerator that goes out. They're a reality in life, and in order for us to win, we must be prepared with an attitude of victory and holding on to God's hand in partnership with Him. Be determined to not lose heart. Let nothing move us. Instead, give ourselves fully to God and trust Him to make us in all these things more than conquerors. Hebrews chapter 11, we read, "Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." On the back of your notes are the words to a song that we're going to play the video on in just a moment. And I'm not going to read all the words, but I want to direct your attention down to, well, it's paragraph 1, paragraph 2, 3, the fourth paragraph on the left side. The fourth paragraph on the left side is, in my mind, an illustration of Hebrews chapter 11. It doesn't matter what you've heard. Impossible is not a word. It's just a reason for someone not to try.